We found a trail of stones arranged in a pattern that changed when we blinked. At first it seemed like a trick of tired eyes. The forest we had entered that morning had a way of exhausting your senses without you noticing. The trees were tall but oddly proportioned, their trunks bending in subtle arcs that made straight lines difficult to judge. When you tried to look far ahead, your depth perception slipped. Distances folded inward. The terrain rose and fell in gentle slopes that never seemed to match the map. By mid-afternoon, we had stopped trusting the compass. "Did you move those?" Aaron asked. He was crouched beside the stones, his voice lower than usual, as if the forest required quiet. "No, there were 9 of them. Smooth river stones, gray and pale green, arranged in a spiral on a patch of damp soil. The spiral tightened toward a small hollow at the center. I blinked. The spiral was gone. The stones now formed a crooked line pointing deeper between the trees. Aaron stared at them. "Okay," he said slowly. "You saw that. I didn't touch them." "Neither did I." We both stood very still. The forest around us was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Not silent. There were sounds, but each one seemed spaced apart like breaths. A distant creak of branches. The faint hiss of wind somewhere higher in the canopy. No birds. The temperature had dropped a few degrees since we stepped into that section of woods. Cold air slid through the trunks in thin currents, brushing our necks and wrists. Aaron rubbed his hands together. "Weird trail marker," he said. I blinked again. The stones had rearranged themselves into a triangle. We both flinched. "Did you?" "No." The word came out at the same time. Aaron crouched closer, studying the soil. "No drag marks," he said. "Nothing disturbed." He reached out slowly, like someone approaching a nervous animal. When his fingers touched one of the stones, a faint clicking sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the forest. Not close, far away, like 2 rocks being tapped together. Aaron froze. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. The air felt colder. He lifted the stone and set it down beside the others, deliberately disrupting the triangle. "Let's see what happens," he said. We stepped back. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then Aaron blinked. The stones had moved again. They formed a perfect circle now, evenly spaced, each one angled inward. Aaron let out a quiet laugh that wasn't really a laugh. "Okay," he said. "That's not possible." Another clicking sound echoed through the trees. This one was closer. The forest seemed to lean inward around us. We followed the stones. Not because we wanted to, because each time we tried to leave, the ground shifted subtly beneath our feet. Paths that looked open curved back into dense undergrowth. Slopes appeared where there had been none minutes earlier. But the stones always appeared again. 9 of them, sometimes ahead of us, sometimes beside the trail, sometimes behind us when we turned around. Each time in a different pattern. Arrow shapes, broken spirals, grids. Aaron began taking photos with his phone. The pictures never matched what we saw. In one image, the stones were arranged in a square. When we looked down, they formed a long line stretching into the trees. The clicking sounds continued. At first, they were distant. Gradually, they began to overlap. One somewhere behind us, one ahead, one off to the right, deeper among the trunks. "Animals," Aaron said once, but the sounds were too rhythmic. Click, pause, click, click, pause, like something speaking a language made of stone. The forest geometry grew stranger the farther we went. Tree trunks twisted at angles that made walking feel disorienting. Shadows stretched in directions that didn't match the light filtering through the canopy. At one point, I looked back at Aaron and realized he seemed farther away than he should have been. The space between us felt longer, elastic. When I blinked, the distance snapped back to normal. The stones appeared again on a flat patch of moss. This time, they formed 2 lines facing each other. Like a corridor. The hollow between them led into a darker section of forest where the trees grew thicker and older. Aaron wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold air. "You notice something?" he said. "What?" "They're not random." I looked down. The stones shifted again when we blinked. Now they formed a grid. 3 by 3. 9 points. Aaron pulled out his phone and showed me something. The earlier photos. Each arrangement. He overlaid them. The patterns connected. Their coordinates, he whispered. For what? Aaron slowly turned toward the darker forest ahead. For here. The clicking sounds erupted all around us. Dozens now. Sharp stone-on-stone echoes bouncing through the trunks. The ground vibrated faintly under our boots. I blinked. The stones were gone. Instead, small depressions dotted the moss in the exact same pattern. 9 holes. Perfectly round. Aaron stepped closer. Inside each hollow was a thin layer of damp soil. And beneath the soil, movement. Something pale shifted just under the surface. Aaron recoiled. The ground behind us clicked. We turned. New stones sat there. 9 again, arranged in a long arrow pointing back toward the holes. Don't, I said quietly. Aaron's breathing had become shallow. You think those are? The soil inside the holes bulged. A pale shape pressed upward, stretching the dirt. Finger-like, or root-like. I blinked. The stones had moved again. Now they formed a tight spiral, centered directly around Aaron's feet. The clicking sounds stopped. The forest held its breath. Aaron looked down. What does that mean? The soil in the holes broke open. 9 pale forms slid upward from beneath the moss. They were not roots. They were limbs. Long, jointless arms made of something smooth and chalk-white, bending in slow arcs like growing branches. At their ends were clusters of small rounded stones. Knuckles. They tapped together. Click, click, click. Aaron staggered back. The spiral of stones around him tightened when we blinked. Each blink pulled them closer to his boots. Run, he whispered. We tried. The terrain warped again. Trees leaned inward, their trunks forming walls. The ground sloped upward in impossible angles. The forest had closed the path. Behind us the pale arms rose higher from the soil. 9 of them, their stone knuckles tapping patterns in the air. Click, 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 click. I blinked. Aaron was gone. In his place, the stones formed a perfect circle again. Inside it lay a shallow depression. Fresh, the soil still settling. The clicking sounds faded slowly as the pale arms sank back beneath the earth. The forest returned to its quiet breathing. I stood there for a long time. Eventually I looked down. The stones had rearranged themselves once more. A spiral. But this one pointed away from the hole, pointing deeper into the forest. When I blinked, the spiral extended. More stones appearing along the moss, leading onward. A trail. Behind me the circle around Aaron's hollow shifted again. The stones there formed a single line. A message. 9 taps echoed faintly through the trees. Click, 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 click. The same pattern repeated. Over and over. And after a while, I realized something that made the cold spread through my bones. The pattern wasn't random. It was the exact rhythm of my footsteps. The forest had learned my movement, and the stones were already arranging themselves ahead of me. A distant bell rang, but the sound came from beneath the soil. At first it was faint enough that I thought it was memory. The forest we had been hiking through that afternoon had the kind of quiet that tricks your brain. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of parks or managed trails. It was heavier than that. The air carried no insects, no birds, no rustling mammals. Even the wind seemed to pass above the canopy without touching the ground. So when the bell sounded, thin, hollow, and slow, it felt like something remembered rather than heard. Dong. Eli stopped walking. You hear that? I nodded. The sound had come from somewhere ahead, but it hadn't traveled like a normal noise. Instead of spreading outward through the trees, it seemed to push upward from below us, as if the earth itself had exhaled the tone. Church, Eli guessed. There's no church out here. We were deep enough into the state forest that even the logging roads had faded to narrow paths. Our map showed nothing but miles of tree cover. Dong. The bell rang again. The The ground under my boots vibrated faintly, like a low hum moving through the soil. Eli crouched and placed his hand on the dirt. You feel that? The forest floor was cool and slightly damp, but beneath the surface there was a trembling, subtle, irregular. Probably underground water, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The trail bent sharply to the left, threading between trees that leaned inward at strange angles. Their trunks curved as if they had grown around something unseen. We followed the bend. The forest light dimmed, not darker in the sense of clouds overhead, but thinner somehow, as though the air itself had thickened and absorbed brightness. Dong. This time the bell sounded closer. The vibration beneath the soil lasted longer. Eli stood slowly. That's not far. No, but the direction felt wrong. The sound came from beneath us, not ahead. We kept walking anyway. Something about the tone had a strange gravity to it. Each time it rang, my body leaned toward it without thinking, the way you turn instinctively toward a voice calling your name. The trail began to slope downward. Not sharply, just enough that gravity tugged us forward. The trees changed as we descended. Their bark grew darker, slick in places as if damp from underground moisture. The roots emerged from the soil in twisted patterns, looping over one another like knotted ropes before disappearing again. Eli's boots scraped against one exposed root. The sound carried strangely. Instead of a sharp crack of wood and gravel, the noise sank into the ground and came back as a dull echo a second later, like something underneath had heard it. Dong. The bell rang again. This time the echo rose through the soil like a breath. The dirt between the roots trembled visibly. Eli stepped back. Okay, he said quietly. That's weird. I looked around. The forest had grown unnaturally still. The branches overhead didn't move. Leaves hung motionless. Even the air felt heavier, pressing against the skin. Another step forward. The ground softened. The soil here was darker and looser, as though it had been turned recently. Dong. The bell sounded again. This time the vibration made the dirt shift in small ripples across the surface. A thin crack opened briefly between two roots before settling closed again. Eli stared at it. You see that? Yes. He crouched and brushed the loose soil away with his fingers. The earth crumbled easily. A few inches down his hand struck something hard. Stone. Flat and smooth. He cleared more dirt. The edge of a slab appeared beneath the soil, its surface etched with faint grooves that formed circles within circles. Old foundation? Eli murmured. But the markings didn't resemble construction. They looked deliberate, careful. Symbols carved into the stone in spiraling patterns. Dong. The bell rang again. The slab vibrated beneath Eli's hand. The grooves filled with darker soil as if something below had shifted. Then we heard it. Not the bell. Something else. A faint metallic shiver beneath the slab. Chains. Very far below. Eli froze. Did you hear? Dong. The bell cut him off. This time the sound burst upward violently, sending a visible tremor through the soil. The dirt around the slab buckled outward. More stone emerged. Another slab. Then another. We stepped back as the ground began to sag between the roots. What we had uncovered wasn't a single buried stone. It was a circle. A ring of slabs arranged beneath the forest floor, each carved with the same spiraling marks. The soil between them had begun to sink, forming shallow depressions, like the roof of something collapsing slowly. Dong. The bell rang again. Now the tone carried a strange distortion. The sound didn't fade normally. It echoed upward through the soil in staggered pulses, like overlapping waves. Dong, dong, dong. The ground shifted again. One of the depressions widened suddenly, the soil spilling inward. For a moment we saw into the darkness beneath. Not deep, but deeper than the forest floor should allow. Stone walls, circular, descending. Eli leaned closer despite himself. Stairs, he whispered. The bell rang again. Dong. From below the slab circle came another sound. A faint scraping movement. something shifting slowly in the dark. Then the echo of the bell returned. Not through the ground this time. From within the hole itself. Dong. But lower. Heavier. Like a second bell answering the first. Eli backed away quickly. "Okay," he said. "We should go." The forest responded instantly. Branches creaked above us. The ground behind us sloped upward where the trail had been. The path had changed. The way out no longer looked familiar. Dong. The bell rang again. The depression widened further. Soil poured inward as the circle of slabs tilted slightly toward the opening. More of the underground structure became visible. Stone walls, carved pillars, and something hanging from the ceiling far below. A dark shape suspended by chains. Eli stared down into the hole. "That's the bell." The shape swayed gently in the darkness. Massive, ancient, its surface covered in carved symbols that matched the slabs above. Dong. The bell moved again, but nothing had touched it. The chains creaked softly as the tone rolled upward through the soil. Then we saw movement deeper in the chamber. At first it looked like shadows shifting along the walls, but the shapes were wrong. Too smooth, too slow. Figures, tall and thin, rising from the darkness like smoke thickening into bodies. Their forms were indistinct, as though made of dust and soil. But they were standing around the bell, watching it, waiting. Dong. The figures moved slightly, not walking, turning, their heads lifted toward the opening where we stood. The air around us grew colder. The forest leaned inward. Roots creaked in the soil. Eli whispered, "We woke something." The bell rang again. Dong. The figures below began to climb, not using the stairs. They moved through the walls themselves, sliding upward through cracks in the stone like rising groundwater. The soil around the hole trembled violently now. More slabs collapsed inward. The opening widened. The shapes were closer, their forms stretching upward through the loose dirt. Dong. The bell rang again. This time it sounded deeper, stronger, like something enormous had struck it from below. The forest floor lurched. Trees groaned as their roots shifted. The earth cracked wider around the circle. Eli grabbed my arm. "We have to run." We turned. The path behind us had reappeared. But it wasn't the same. The terrain sloped downward toward the hole now, subtly funneling everything back to the center. Dong. The bell rang again. And this time the echo that returned was not just the bell. It was a chorus of deeper tones. More bells, many of them, far beneath the earth. Answering. The figures had nearly reached the surface now, their upper forms emerging through the loose soil around the slabs. Their faces were blank shapes made of packed dirt, but their mouths moved slowly, as if speaking, or chanting. Dong. The forest floor cracked again. A deep fissure opened beside the slab circle, revealing another stone wall below. Another chamber. Another hanging bell, its chains swaying gently. Then another fissure opened further away. Another bell. Another chamber. The forest was full of them, buried structures stretching beneath the trees in every direction. All of them connected, all of them ringing now. Dong, dong, dong. The sound rose from beneath the entire forest like a buried cathedral waking. The soil trembled violently under our boots. Roots snapped. The figures continued climbing from the earth. Hundreds now, emerging between trees, through the dirt, through the shifting ground. All of them turning toward the sound, toward the bells, and slowly, toward us. We ran. Branches tore at our arms as we forced our way uphill. Behind us the bell tones grew louder, closer. The ground pulsed like something breathing beneath it. Dong, dong, dong. When we finally reached the ridge where the forest thinned, the sounds faded slightly. The vibrations lessened. The terrain stopped shifting. We didn't stop running until the road appeared through the trees. Only when we reached the gravel did the bells finally fall silent. For a long time we stood there listening to the quiet. The forest looked normal again. Still, empty. But as we drove away, one final sound reached us through the open window. Very faint, Very deep, dong. And beneath that tone, barely audible, came the slow grinding of chains moving far underground, as if something enormous had begun to rise, and the bells had only been the signal to wake it.